to Cold War 2.0.
World knows that. If you want to understand international politics today, it is very important to keep in mind that we are in a new Cold War. The United States is waging Cold War II against China, and all of U.S. foreign policy revolves around the attempt by the U.S. to try to weaken and isolate China. And part of Washington's strategy is to try to recruit partners in Asia in order to encircle and contain China. Bloomberg referred to this as the Trump administration's grand encirclement plan, but it's not just the Trump administration. It was the same in the Joe Biden administration and the Obama administration before that. Bloomberg reported that the countries that the U.S. is trying to partner with in order to isolate China as part of this grand encirclement strategy are Japan, South Korea, India, and Vietnam. And if you listen to hawkish anti-China think tanks in Washington, they constantly talk about how Vietnam has become a close U.S. partner and the U.S. is going to use Vietnam in order to weaken China. That's the narrative you constantly hear in Washington. And it is true that Vietnam has tried to maintain a non-aligned foreign policy, balancing both sides of this new Cold War. Vietnam refers to its foreign policy strategy as one of bamboo diplomacy. The former top official in the Vietnamese government, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Nguyen Phu Trong, famously described this bamboo diplomacy strategy as one that is strong and flexible like bamboo, and it's based on the principle of having more friends and fewer foes. So Vietnam has balanced close relations with China and Russia and also the US and US allies like South Korea. But despite this, there's still this very simplistic narrative that you hear in Washington and in the Western media claiming that Vietnam is a US ally and Vietnam hates China just like the US. Which is why a lot of people in the West may have been surprised to see a bombshell story that was published in February in the...
I'm back. What did I miss? Cold War 4.0.
Western media, revealing that according to an internal document from Vietnam's Ministry of Defense, Vietnam has been preparing for a possible second war with the United States. This was reported on by the Associated Press, the AP, the most mainstream of mainstream US media outlets. This article noted that Vietnam is preparing for a possible American war of aggression, and Hanoi considers the US to be a belligerent power. The Vietnamese government also fears a US-backed color revolution attempt to try to overthrow the Communist Party, like the US-backed color revolutions in Ukraine and the Philippines, among many other countries. Vietnam's Ministry of Defense noted that the US empire is trying to encircle and weaken China, and it pointed out that the US may apply unconventional forms of warfare and military intervention and even invasions of countries that deviate from the US empire's orbit. And Vietnam wrote that Washington is trying to pressure other Asian nations to form a front against China. And the document makes it clear that Vietnam will not be part of this US attempt to contain and isolate China in the new Cold War. The AP report pointed out that far from viewing the US as a strategic partner, Hanoi sees Washington as an existential threat and has no intention of joining its anti-China alliance. So again, this is an absolute bombshell report. It certainly didn't surprise me because I never drank the Kool-Aid and never believed the Western propaganda. But this was certainly a shock to many so-called experts in Washington because the narrative coming out of Washington for years is that Vietnam is a close US partner, even potentially an ally against China. Back in 2023, the Joe Biden administration announced that it had elevated US-Vietnam relations to the highest level ever of a comprehensive strategic partnership. And then in 2024, the Pentagon, formerly known as the Department of Defense, now more appropriately named the Department of War, the Pentagon boasted that defense cooperation with Vietnam was growing, and in general, U.S.-Vietnam relations were deepening and getting closer and closer. But that same year, in 2024, when the Pentagon was boasting of its very close relationship with Vietnam, meanwhile, at the same time, the Vietnamese Ministry of Defense was preparing this secret internal document, making plans for a potential new war with the U.S., of course, in self-defense, if the U.S. invades Vietnam and attacks Vietnam as part of the new Cold War against China, which again, Vietnam has made it clear it refuses to join the U.S. in this new Cold War. I think this document from the Vietnamese government is extremely important, not only for what it says about Vietnam, but I think many countries around the world are adopting a similar position. Of course,
we are seeing a massive pivot in which the smartest countries are moving away from a failing project. Okay, this is when empire starts to decline. You can do two things: you can play it neutral, you can remain attached to the current imperial project, or you can shop around. The earlier you start shopping around, the earlier you bet on a potential outcome, in this case, unipolarity dying, the more you can earn for yourself through said bet. So countries that are doing a China pivot now very openly, very directly, have the most to gain from a potential alliance, both in matters of trade, in matters of military, in matters of cultural exchange with the People's Republic of China. As time passes and as it becomes more and more obvious that we're seeing American decline, if that's the way things turn out, the less potential benefits you will gain, because there's going to be more competition vying for Chinese alliance-induced benefits. And this rocada, this moving of this reimagining of relationships is usually what happens in these particular gap periods. Basically, every state head is sitting right now. Some have more cards and more chips. Some have less cards and less chips. And they're deciding what way to go. The earlier you bet, the more you can win. And the later you bet, the safer it is, but the less you can win.
Afraid of the U.S. because the U.S. is a crazy rogue regime that is constantly invading countries and attacking them and bombing them and kidnapping their presidents and imposing illegal sanctions and organizing coups d'etat and regime change operations and color revolutions and interfering in their elections and their internal affairs. Pretty much everyone around the world knows that, and governments are always making plans to prepare to try to defend their sovereignty.
Dropping $2.45 in China, winning Cold War 2.0, otherwise known as American decline, by flailing about in front of China.
Against U.S. meddling. But at the same time, publicly, in terms of their foreign relations and their diplomacy, they have to try to maintain good relations with the U.S., because they know that if they anger the U.S. and openly challenge the U.S. empire, as was done, for instance,
arguably, especially with the current administration, the smartest thing you can do is be like, Donald Trump, you're the best. You're the fucking legend, okay? I fucking love you. Your administration is incredible. Your country is incredible, while doing the complete opposite in the background. There, the bet is that the American intelligence agencies aren't doing their part. But hey, it's a pretty decent bet, if you ask me. Simply looking at all the contradictions piling up in the States, right? Internal division, inefficiency of the state, lack of investment in general education of the public, which leads to short-term political gains for those with political pitches that are for quite literal, let's be honest, troglodytes. I'm sorry for sounding a little bit elitist there, but that in the long term will leave the country without any real base of experts that can elevate it both technologically, militarily, and even economically. It's number 275 on the list of thousands of contradictions in the United States itself. The main contradiction of U.S. Wealth hoarding is its inability to, on average, from decade to decade, increase the amount of rents it extracts from its quote-unquote colonies. The decrease in the amount of rents that they can extract, aka resources, aka cheap labor, and so on, is an inevitability due to the, let's just call it, industrialization of those countries and an alternative, both trading partner, military partner, and everything else, potentially seen in the People's Republic of China, and maybe even alternatively certain South American blocs, and if the Europeans finally decuck themselves, certain European countries that are willing to operate outside of the scope of being America's lapdogs. So you have alternatives to the United States when it comes to trade and military development. You have the main economic model of the United States, which is exploitation of the developing world, declining in how many rents it can receive. And then you have immense domestic instability in the United States itself. All of that, if I'm not talking like a socialist here, I'm talking like somebody who, if I was in any foreign policy planning team and I was, or any intelligence agency or anything, and I was drafting analyses that I would give to the executive body of my state when it comes to long-term planning on where we want Germany to go, where we want France to go, when we want Brazil to go, where we want Ghana to go, where we want Kenya to go, where we want Kazakhstan to go, etc., 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 etc. That is the analysis that I would deliver them, because this is like an ideological analysis. It's sure, it's underpinned by the dialectical materialism, but it is just looking reality in the eye. That's what it is. Absolutely all the signs are there. What can the Americans use, though, to slow down this anti-American pivot? Well, it's very simple. It's called not going down without a fight. Quite literally threatening immense levels of violence, which they are currently doing, to as a method, threatening incredible levels of violence as a way of slowing down said decline. So while you as a state can see America's fall as the hegemon, you still are not incentivized to jump ship, because in the period leading towards them falling as a hegemon, they can still do an immense, and let's be honest, an immense amount of damage to you. That's why the smartest operators on the realpolitik arena are going to be playing a double game. And if they are careful enough, if they are smart enough, if they know how to properly communicate either with Beijing or their own domestic, let's say, American skeptic representatives of both large capital, if we're talking about capitalist countries, but also political and other elites, if they manage to game it properly, they will want to appear as not pivoting away from the United States of America, while pivoting away from the United States of America. And any political representative, any head of state, any party leading anything on planet Earth that is not currently engaging in exactly that. Sorry for the defocus. That is not currently engaging in exactly that type of realpolitik is going to fail in the long term, is going to have bet on the wrong horse. That is my analysis of what is to be done in the face of American decline. What is to be done in the United States itself? Well, if you're an American and you understand that the only reason the world has not exacted revenge on your country, which basically means, unfortunately, in the long term, on the most disadvantaged members and citizens of your country, because when shit starts hitting the fan, that's who ends up paying the toll. If you don't want that to hit you on the face, you want to both organize and encourage organization that will allow for an as peaceful transition from hegemon state to that of, one of the many powers on the planet to transpire. You want to be as cool-headed. You want the executive body of the American establishment to be as cool-headed during this transition period as a means to limit the amount of blowback you will inevitably feel. That is not to be anti-American. That is not to be a traitor to your people, your country, whatever, if you still have those sorts of patriotic sentiments. It is quite the opposite. It is the opposite. It is facing a new reality and doing everything you can to limit the amount of blowback average American citizens are going to feel. Did we hit hour 2? Yes. Producer telling me we hit hour 2. If you like the type of analysis we do here and the type of show we run, please do consider subscribing. $6 a month, free through Prime or by paying your taxes. Westerners, you heard what I just said. Invest in principled anti-American rhetoric that unironically wants to save as many American lives as possible by paying your taxes, subscribing individually, and supporting the show in every way, shape, or form. Thank you very much for your consideration. Let's continue this great geopolitical report. I met him. He was very cool. We ate frogs in China. Unironically, I ate frogs with this dude. He was chill.
By Venezuela's president, Nicolás Maduro, they know
not Maduro, you dumb fucks.
That they could be the next leader to be kidnapped and imprisoned by the U.S. and forced through a show trial on fake charges. This is a real threat hanging over many leaders and governments around the world. So like Vietnam, publicly, they try to maintain good relations with the U.S. and they talk about the importance of diplomacy with the U.S. and balancing relations with China and Russia and other powers. But secretly, all of these governments know that they have to be prepared for the U.S. to attack them. They know the U.S. empire can never be trusted. And in a few minutes here, I'm going to look at some specific quotes from this extraordinary report from the Vietnamese government. But first, I want to situate it in the larger context of the U.S. imperial strategy that was outlined in the 2025 National Security Strategy published by the Trump administration. This document makes it clear that the fundamental goal of U.S. foreign policy is to remain the world's strongest, richest, and most powerful country, and to prevent any other major power from challenging U.S. global dominance. And of course, China is the only country that is powerful enough to challenge the U.S. economically, technologically, militarily, politically, diplomatically, and in other realms. So in order to prepare for this new Cold War with China that's going to be decades, we're not talking about a short-term conflict here. The Trump administration strategy in the short term is to reimpose, through the use of force, U.S. hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, especially in Latin America. So the Trump administration has been openly invoking the 200-year-old colonial Monroe Doctrine. And the U.S. is threatening all the countries in the Western Hemisphere that have close relations with China and telling them they have to break off their relations with China. And they have to give the U.S. and U.S. corporations, more specifically, control of all of the strategic minerals and other natural resources in the Western Hemisphere. And U.S. corporations must control all of the important infrastructure and geostrategic choke points in the region. It's just straight up imperialism. So the 2025 U.S. National Security Strategy identifies the Western Hemisphere as the most important region for the U.S. empire. But the second most important region identified is the Asia-Pacific region, which the U.S. refers to as the so-called Indo-Pacific. And the National Security Strategy says that the U.S. wants to win the economic future in Asia, even though the U.S. is not even in Asia. And the document says that, quote, the Indo-Pacific is already and will continue to be among the next century's key economic and geopolitical battlegrounds. To thrive at home, we must successfully compete there, end quote. And the strategy adds that it was a mistake for the U.S. government to ever engage with China and have good relations with China in the 80s and 90s. And now the Trump administration, following the Biden administration and the Obama...
Does anybody have that clip of Hillary Clinton on China? It's incredible. And kind of shows that 80s pivot. Is it this one? I think it was this one.
Stop on Korea, Afghanistan.
Oh, come on, does anybody have that one where she says, it is communism, it is going to fuck us? It's a classic. If somebody finds me a link, I will be very grateful.
Administration, they're trying to reverse that by isolating China. And this is where the Trump administration's so-called grand encirclement...
Yeah, I learned that the Obama deal to restrain Iran's nuclear power was a ploy for their oil to try and push China out. Also, that China wouldn't back down in the UN project Assad, the UN to protect Assad in like 11-12, and suspicious your Gulf allies armed proxies that went and stole Syria's oil. Yeah.
Strategy comes in. The document makes it clear that the U.S. plans on working with its so-called allies and partners in the Asia-Pacific region.
Damn, Steez, you fucking G, man. Damn, that was fast, baby. Yeah, this and this.
Oh, well, you know, that disrupts the market. China has disrupted the market. China is not a free market economy. We tried. We let them into the World Trade Organization. We sent our businesses over there. We made trade deals. They are a controlled, top-down economy. We will never compete and win against them unless you take back the means of production.
Started from the bottom, now we way up. And I got the baddest bitch, she stays up. Ain't no fucking playing, we ain't game boys.
Keep winning, bro. They keep winning.
In order to, quote, use our combined economic power to help safe...
I mean, chat, low-key, look at this. I am owned by my dengest overlords. I'm the people's favorite revisionist.
Guard our prime position in the world economy, end quote. So in other words, try to economically strangle China, to isolate China and maintain U.S. global economic hegemony. And the
He talks like this, by the way. He talks like this IRL as well. It's quite interesting. He's very journalism head. He's a very journalism head.
Document proposes
It's very cool.
Is that the U.S. should continue to improve relations with India as part of the Quad, the quadrilateral.
The first thing he said when we met was like, oh man, you're huge. I'm like, I'm just normal. That's how they make us in the Balkans. I'm just normal pakage. I am normal packaged. Come on, don't call me huge.
Federal security dialogue. And it also mentions that the U.S. will continue to work more closely with Europe, Japan, South Korea, and Australia in order to spread so-called free market capitalism all around the world and force countries to see the United States as their, quote, global partner of first choice.
Oh, bravo, Daichi. That's a lot of fucking consecutives. Thank you.
End quote.
2 meters almost.
Which, in other words, means that Washington is going to try to force these countries to put U.S. interests above their own national interests and to sacrifice their own independent foreign policy to adopt a foreign policy that benefits Washington. The strategy adds that the U.S. will present partners with inducements in order to, quote, tip decisions in our favor, end quote. So in other words, to use carrots and sticks to force countries to make decisions that benefit Washington. So that's the U.S. government strategy stated very clearly in its own words for public consumption. We don't even know what they're saying internally, privately. It's certainly much more hawkish and much more aggressive. But regardless, the idea in Washington that it can force the countries in any region, but especially in the Asia-Pacific region, to simply go along with the U.S. empire and do whatever is convenient for the U.S., this is preposterous. And this internal document from
They no longer have the leverage. They no longer have the opinion of the developing world that they are untouchable. All the pieces are in place for American skeptic foreign policy being led by most of the world, especially places that the United States has previously intervened in, where the, call it whatever, deep state or whatever, in those particular countries has a very, very long memory and sees their relationship to the United States only as temporarily utilitarian.
From the Vietnamese government shows that around the world, governments know that the U.S. cannot be trusted. It is an aggressive, belligerent imperial power, and publicly they can say one thing, but privately they have to make plans for a potential war with the U.S. because they can see what could potentially be coming in the future. And this is why you should be very...
One could argue that every country has to do that. Like every country's defense ministry should have
skeptical when you see the U.S. government...
a plan outlined for earthquakes, for floods, for climate change, for school shootings, and for America invading. You know, stuff that just can happen. So right after our discussion about what to do if earthquake, we have to talk about something that has an even higher probability of happening: Americans invading.
Announce that it has elevated its relations with countries like Vietnam to the level of a comprehensive strategic partnership. And they portray this as an example of how the U.S. has all of these allies around the world who are joining it in the new Cold War. Now, what's so funny about that news from 2023 is that very few people mentioned that China and Vietnam also have a comprehensive strategic partnership. And China and Vietnam came to that agreement way back in 2008, 15 years before the U.S. announced that it had done.
Every country on earth is permanently locked into the keep America from invading us this week option on the focus tree. It's leveled out the wazoo. It's the first thing we put our XP on.
The same. And by the way, when China and Vietnam established their comprehensive strategic partnership, it was the first time that China had agreed to one with a country in ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And
they call it the Eastern Balkans.
By the way, ASEAN has been the largest trading partner of China now for 16 years. And China is also Vietnam's #1 trading partner. So as the U.S. wages this new Cold War, I think Vietnam is the perfect example of how many countries in the Global South are seeing this conflict. They don't want to join in the new Cold War. They want to be non-aligned. This is why the original non-aligned movement was formed back in 1961 during the first Cold War, and most countries on Earth, that is, the global South countries, joined the
Slavic white boy keep winning.
non-aligned movement. And today the non-aligned movement does still exist, but another...
But Yugoslavia is part of the Western Hemisphere. Yeah, I'm good, bro. I'm kind of good. I'm good. Next.
Another organization that has become more prominent and represents the spirit of the non-aligned movement is BRICS. And this is why it's not a surprise that in 2025, Vietnam accepted the invitation to join BRICS as a partner country. With the addition of Vietnam, BRICS now has 10 full member countries and 10 partner countries, and together they represent over half of the world population and 44% of global GDP measured at purchasing power parity. So it is not an exaggeration to say that BRICS literally represents the global majority. And I want to talk a bit about Vietnam's economy, because Vietnam has been a major success story for the global South. When you measure Vietnam's GDP at purchasing power parity, and you measure it per capita, per head, so you can account for the differences in population with other countries, you can see that Vietnam has economically developed extremely fast. Back in 1980, Vietnam was actually at the same level of development as India, and Pakistan's GDP per capita was nearly twice that of Vietnam, and the Philippines' GDP per capita was 3 times that of Vietnam. But if you fast forward to today, Vietnam's GDP per capita is significantly higher than that of India and the Philippines, and it is nearly 3 times the size of Pakistan's. But GDP can be a bit misleading, even GDP per capita, because if you have a small number of people who are very rich, GDP per capita may look higher, but it doesn't take into account the extreme inequality. So it's actually more useful to look at median income or median consumption per day.
Exactly.
And this is using data from the World Bank. And you can see that actually Vietnam has been extremely successful in raising median income. And now it's actually at the same level as China, significantly above the world.
They call this stream the Vietnam of Twitch because there might not be many of us, but we do make number go up. Hey.
Average. Median income in China and Vietnam is around 13 or 14 US dollars per day, whereas the world average is just over 8 US dollars per day. India.
Hassan is China. Mike from PA, shout out, is Brazil. And we are Vietnam. The Vietnam of, that's why we love gambling. Vietnamese people love gambling as well. But we do it ethically. We do it socialistly.
Is less than $6 per day. And Ethiopia, which has also been a major success story in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, Ethiopia's median consumption per day is less than $4. So what's even more incredible about this is if you go back to the early 1990s, Vietnam's median income per day was lower than all of these countries and significantly below the global average. So Vietnam has made incredible progress in just a few decades. And Vietnam's economic model is very similar to that of China. Some people refer to it as export-led growth, but I actually think it's a bit misleading. A better term is investment-led growth. Vietnam's economic development has been driven by fixed capital formation, investing in factories and infrastructure in order to industrialize the economy. And when you look at gross fixed capital formation as a percentage of GDP in Vietnam, you can see that it's higher than in very advanced developed countries like Japan, France, the US, and the UK, especially because, the US and the UK have deindustrialized and financialized their economies, whereas Vietnam has followed China, not at the same level, but with an investment-led model. And like China, Vietnam has become a major factory for the world. Vietnam now produces many important electronics. And when you look at Vietnam's exports, you can see that, like many global South countries, it still does export commodities like agriculture and low value added minerals and such and textiles. But actually, when you look at the growth in exports in the past 15 years, the bulk of that growth has come from exporting electronics, as Vietnam has become a major manufacturing hub. And politically, Vietnam is also very similar to China once again. Vietnam is, of course, governed by a communist party, and Vietnam initiated a reform process in order to create what it calls a socialist-oriented...
I'm not going to lie, though. The Vietnam-China beef is so absurd and so unnecessary and should be left in the past. Both of them really need to fucking move on. Like, for real. For real. Though one can understand why Vietnam at the current moment is playing kind of a shadow boxing game in which it is pretending to box against China as a American proxy, while, as we're learning from this particular video and this particular report, while at the same time being incredibly America skeptic to such an extent that they even, passively prepare for war against the state in the background. 5D chess, no joke. 5D chess.
market economy. And this is very similar to the model.
Can you expand on that? I know Chinese and Vietnamese, and they all have different versions of why they hate each other. It's the same like the Balkans. Oh, you impeded on my sovereignty once. No, but we only did that because you impeded on our sovereignty. Oh, no, but we did that impeachment of your sovereignty because you did that to us before. Ooh, that's nationalist dog shit. It's nationalist ego-fueled fucking dog shit. Move on. You are class-based. You're supposed to be dictatorships of the proletariat, fucking, state capitalist countries looking towards the socialist, enlightened, scientific path, etc., etc. Get over it. Fucking get over it. No joke. Like, it should be as simple as that. Get the fuck over it. But I understand that's easier said than done because it's hard to pitch that to your population, especially when there's past beef. And that's why, you can, but that doesn't mean you can't start it as a long-term project of de-radicalizing your population when it comes to their perspective towards a potential future key ally.
Implemented by China starting in 1978 when the reform and opening up was initiated by the leader Deng Xiaoping. And China refers to its model as a socialist market economy. So again, Vietnam's is a socialist-oriented market economy. China's is a socialist market economy. Clearly, these two countries are learning from each other and borrowing a lot of ideas and policies. And like in China, in Vietnam, the state remains the driver, the motor of the economy. If you read the statements of the Vietnamese government and media outlets, you see very clearly they always emphasize the leading role of the state in Vietnam's economy, with the central role of state-owned enterprises that own the most important parts of the economy, the commanding heights, like in China. What's also very interesting about Vietnam is it has a very strict, non-aligned foreign policy. This is extremely important for Vietnam. In fact, Hanoi has proposed something it refers to as the Four No's policy.
To add some more context for Vietnam, the party has entered several IP exchange agreements in tech and manufacturing sectors with Western corporations. By 2040, we expect to be at the upper end of middle-income countries. Food insecurity has rapidly reduced, and we expect to solve urban homelessness before 2030. China has invaded us multiple times. Fuck China, but the model they have is good. There you go. The Balkan thing. It's everywhere, always. But yeah. It's not my place to tell you to kind of, look more towards the future than the past. But thank you for the update. Didn't know you were Vietnamese. You're Vietnamese? That's crassy. By any means necessary is a fucking OG of chat.
And what exactly are those four no's? Well, Vietnam has pledged the following. 1, no partaking in military alliances. 2, no siding with one country to act against another. 3, no foreign military bases in Vietnamese territory or using Vietnam as leverage to counteract other countries. And 4, no using force or threatening to use force in international relations. Now, this is a very basic concept of Vietnamese politics. You don't need to know a lot about Vietnam to understand this. I'm certainly not an expert on Vietnam. And yet, when you go to Washington and you look at the so-called foreign policy experts in U.S. think tanks, they thought that the U.S. could pressure Vietnam to ally with Washington against Beijing, despite the fact that Vietnam has explicitly said it will not side with one country to act against another. So this just shows how ignorant and arrogant U.S. policymakers and so-called experts are in U.S. think tanks. So on that note,
How can you breathe with that mask? The will of the proletariat. Yes. I cannot breathe. I'm actually dead. I feed off of chat's comments.
brings
That's
me
my food.
back to the issue that I began this analysis with today, which is this leaked
Oh, fuck, I'm interviewing Bad Hasbara in 1 hour. You know, Bad Hasbara, very good podcast. They're coming on the show. I'm the lead fucking interviewer guy. The program always have like one of the three of us leads the thing, prepares the thing, and the other guys are there for fun. Today it is me. Though it should be a very easy conversation. Those guys are so good. They're very funny. They're very funny. Very, very funny. Oh, nice, Mr. Husband of Fran. The first question of the podcast will be, yo, so I heard you celebrate October 7th. Because his daughter is born on October 7th. Oh. Can't wait.
internal document from the Vietnamese government detailing how Vietnam's military is making plans for a potential second war with the U.S. Now, they say they don't think this is likely, but they're making plans just in case. And this document was obtained by a group called...
We will be going on Bad Hasbara on the 20th. On the 20th of fucking February. It is known that Yugopnik breathes through alcohol. It's dry February. That means I'm choking. I am choking. Chalky chokes.
called Project 88. Now, what exactly is Project 88? Well, it is a US-based organization. It claims to be a so-called independent NGO, but then it says on its website that it welcomes support from governments. So it's not really independent. And again, it's based in the US, and it explicitly calls for adopting liberal democracy with so-called free and fair elections. So this is a pro-Western organization that
Project 88 also, his name is carrying so much. Holy Mother of God, come on.
focuses on Vietnam, but it's actually based in the US, and it's against the Vietnamese government, obviously.
Project 1428 SS. Agartha.
So that context is important to keep in mind that this is an anti-Vietnam
That will liberate the Vietnamese people and lead them to the true Agarthan path.
organization, but the document that it obtained is very interesting, and I think we can learn a lot from looking at this document. The report that they obtained is officially called the Second U.S. Invasion Plan, and they noted that far from seeing the U.S. as a partner on par with China and Russia, Hanoi views Washington as a belligerent superpower that invades countries which deviate from its orbit. Which, by the way, I mean, that's just an objective characterization of U.S. foreign policy. And the Vietnamese report, the government referred to, quote, the U.S.'s belligerent nature, end quote. And they warned of the possibility of, quote, the U.S. and its allies creating a pretext to launch a war of aggression against our country, end quote. Now, what's interesting about this document is it was issued in August 2024 at the end of the Joe Biden administration, although it's also very critical of Donald Trump. So it's critical of Democrats and Republicans. And the report makes it very clear that Vietnam wants no part of any China containment strategy. And Vietnam views Washington's promotion of so-called freedom and democracy as a cynical ploy to maintain U.S. hegemony. which again is just an objective observation. It's an objective truth. And Vietnamese military leaders are concerned that Washington is encircling China with a network of bases and alliance that could also be used to strike Vietnam. And they emphasize that Trump is not a reliable partner either. So the U.S. in general is not a reliable partner regardless of who the president is. The report also shows that Vietnam understands that when U.S. officials claim they supposedly respect Vietnam's political system, they know those U.S. officials are lying. And in fact, they know that the U.S. is using rhetoric of so-called human rights and democracy in order to try to pursue regime change, to carry out a color revolution to overthrow the Communist Party and the Vietnamese government. And they also recognize that the U.S. so-called Indo-Pacific strategy is a threat not only against China, which is the main target, but it's also a threat against Vietnam. The Vietnamese government wrote that the U.S. wants Vietnam to be a, quote, ally in its plan to encircle and contain China from the East Sea, end quote.
That is such a 1986 plan. You guys do not have the scope for any of that at this moment. Any of that. Oh, dude, what a LARP.
And they also added, this is an official quote from the report, that the U.S. is seeking, quote, changing the socialist regime of our country, end quote. And this is why the article...
Oh, we lost a pet? Come on, we should play with a pet a little bit before we shoot him in the forest. I smoke it when they start going after chatters. No one fucks with you all other than mods and Yugo. Yeah. I agree. What was he saying? I missed him. I can't go back to on banned people. What did I miss? Sorry. I was too mesmerized by G's eyes there. What did I miss him? What did I miss before Barry murdered this man in cold blood? Barry is our dog killer lady. They just said to take your mask off. Oh, that's a classic. Come on. I could have played with that classic. Did the whole, like, should ICE remove their masks too pivot? That one's always very fun. They said the wrong your too. The King's English is strong in the yank. Said, take the shiesty off, you not tough. Then told Comrade Internet to shut up. Okay. So, okay, not very interesting pet. Not a very interesting dog. I want interesting dogs, interesting pets.
China as an existential threat, but it does see Washington as an existential threat. Going on in this document, the Vietnamese military analyzed how the U.S. imperial strategy toward China has shifted over the years. It noted that back in 2011, Obama declared the so-called pivot to Asia, but then later in Trump's first term and in the Biden administration, the U.S. expanded the so-called pivot to Asia into its so-called Indo-Pacific strategy, where the U.S. is trying to partner with countries in the region to contain China. Vietnam noted that there are several pillars.
And to give you, like, okay, that's the stick. The carrot is, we've learned everything we can from this video. Excellent video. Go please subscribe to Geopolitical Economy Report. We don't agree on everything, but we do on most things. And I think he does incredible analysis, for real. Dear friend of the show. He's very cool. As a gift to you, because we've covered most political topics, let's cover the political one. Like 50 people have sent me this, so I guess I have to watch it.